There are moments in history when the world changes in a single morning, but there is one question about Pearl Harbor that historians, survivors, and soldiers have whispered for decades. A question so unsettling, so controversial, that governments have spent years burying documents under classification. It's a question that begins long before the bombs fell, long before the sirens wailed, long before the sky over Oahu turned black with smoke. A question that asks, did someone know this attack was coming and stay silent? This is the story of Pearl Harbor like you've never heard it before, a story of heroes, secrets, warnings ignored, and a truth that took decades to uncover. And by the time we reach the final part of this series, you will understand the answer to that question and why the truth was hidden for so long. Before we uncover this gripping chapter of history, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss the moments that shaped our world. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And whatever you do, stay with me until the very end, because the final twist in this story isn't just shocking, it rewrites everything you thought you knew.
On December 7th, 1941, the island of Oahu woke up like any other peaceful Sunday morning. The sun had barely risen, painting the sky in soft shades of blue and gold. Palm trees swayed lazily in the warm Pacific breeze. Sailors on the battleships of Pearl Harbor prepared for a quiet, slow day. Some cleaned the decks, some planned letters home. Others slept in hammocks without a worry in the world. The United States was not officially at war, and despite rumors of tension with Japan, few believed danger could reach these distant Hawaiian shores. But beneath that calm, beneath the soft morning light, something darker was already approaching, unseen, unheard, yet destined to change the course of human history.
Hundreds of miles away, a formation of Japanese aircraft sliced silently through the sky, flying low over the ocean to avoid detection. At the head of this formation was Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, a man who had spent years preparing, studying, and perfecting the strategy for this very attack. His eyes remained fixed on the silhouette of Oahu that slowly emerged on the horizon, and his hand tightened over the controls as he waited to deliver the message that would send the world into chaos. What made this moment even more chilling is that amid Hawaii's peaceful morning, signals, hints, and warnings had been appearing for days. Strange intercepted communications, reports of missing Japanese diplomats, last-minute movements in the Pacific, small puzzle pieces that no one had managed to put together in time. At the Pearl Harbor Naval Base, life moved slowly that morning. The battleship USS Arizona rested proudly in the calm water, its massive hull gleaming under the rising sun. Sailors joked with each other, planned their breakfast, and even prepared for a routine inspection later that day. For them, war felt like an ocean away. No one imagined that in just minutes, their peaceful Sunday would turn into a nightmare of fire, steel, and death. Not far away, in the radar station at Opana Point, two young American soldiers, George Elliott and Joseph Lockard, watched their radar screen with mild interest. Radar was still a new technology, barely understood by most, and the soldiers were only half paying attention as the screen slowly swept its circular pattern. But then, suddenly, something unusual appeared, a massive cluster of incoming objects heading toward the island. Dozens, maybe more. The two young men stared at each other. It was far too large to be a squadron of American planes, but what else could it possibly be? Lockard picked up the phone immediately, calling the information center, but the officer who answered dismissed their concerns within seconds. He told them it was probably a flight of American B-17 bombers arriving from California. Nothing to worry about. Don't worry about it, he said. It's fine. It was a mistake that would haunt America forever. Back at sea, aboard the Japanese aircraft carrier Akagi, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind this operation, stood silently on the bridge. He knew this attack, if successful,
would awaken a sleeping giant. He also knew Japan could not win a long war against the industrial might of the United States. But the leadership in Tokyo insisted this was the only path. And so the planes were launched. Yamamoto whispered words that later became famous. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., something strange was happening. American intelligence officers had intercepted a critical message from Tokyo the night before. It was coded, one of the infamous purple codes, and decrypting it took time. But by early morning, as the sun shone over Pearl Harbor, U.S. officials in Washington were finally piecing together the message. It was a 14-part warning from Japan, almost certainly indicating war was imminent. Yet even then, the message wasn't delivered quickly enough to the commanders in Hawaii. Miscommunication, delays, and disbelief slowed everything down. At Pearl Harbor, the clock struck 7:49 a.m.
Commander Fuchida looked down at the harbor through the cloudy morning air. Battleships lined the water like sleeping giants. Aircraft were parked wing to wing on the airfields, making them easy targets. Everything was quiet. Everything looked exactly as they had hoped. He grabbed his radio transmitter. "Tora! Tora! Tora!" These 3 words, meaning tiger, 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 confirmed a perfect surprise attack. Within seconds, the first wave of Japanese aircraft dove toward the harbor with deafening engines. Sailors looked up in confusion as dark shapes filled the sky. Some thought it was a drill. Others simply froze, unable to understand what they were seeing. Then the bombs began to fall. A torpedo bomber streaked low over the water and released its deadly cargo, sending it straight toward the USS Oklahoma. Another plane dropped armor-piercing bombs onto the USS Arizona. In seconds, explosions erupted across the harbor. Fireballs rose into the sky, metal twisted and shattered, oil spilled into the water, igniting into burning rivers. On the USS Arizona, a massive explosion tore through the forward magazines, a blast so powerful it lifted the whole ship into the air. The explosion killed over 1,000 sailors instantly. The ship sank within 9 minutes, leaving behind one of the most haunting images of the entire war: smoke, fire, and burning oil covering the water's surface.
Sailors ran in every direction, some toward the flames to rescue their brothers, others diving into the oil-soaked water to escape. Stories of heroism unfolded everywhere. Men carried wounded shipmates out of infernos. Anti-aircraft gunners fired back barefoot, half-dressed or still bleeding. Fires burned so hot that the heat could be felt hundreds of meters away. At Wheeler Field, a young pilot named Ken Taylor sprinted to his fighter plane, still wearing his tuxedo trousers from the previous night's party. He took off under fire, climbing into the sky to fight back. He and his friend George Welch became the first American fighter pilots to engage the Japanese that morning. By 8 a.m., the entire harbor was engulfed in smoke so thick it turned the morning into darkness. Explosions echoed across Oahu. Civilians watched from their homes in horror as their peaceful island turned into a battlefield. Back in Washington, D.C., frantic phone calls finally went out to Hawaii, but it was too late. The attack was already underway. America, a nation that had desperately tried to remain neutral, was now being dragged into World War II with unimaginable force. And yet, beneath all this devastation, beneath all the chaos, one question lingered like a shadow. How did so many warnings get missed? How did an attack of this scale catch the world's most powerful nation completely off guard? Was it simply human error, or something more? The answers would not be revealed until decades later.
On the night before that unforgettable morning of December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor lay silent beneath the velvet-black Hawaiian sky. Most of the sailors on the battleships were already asleep, some writing letters home, some playing cards below deck, and others listening to the distant sound of Honolulu nightlife fading into the night. At the same time, thousands of miles away, the Imperial Japanese Navy moved through the Pacific like ghosts, maintaining absolute radio silence as if they were a fleet of shadows drifting across the ocean. Not a single light flickered on their decks, not a single message leaked into the air. Every man in that fleet knew that by sunrise, the world would never be the same again. Meanwhile, Washington, D.C. was unaware of the storm racing toward Hawaii. American intelligence had intercepted several Japanese communications, but none of them explicitly stated the target. Some believed the Philippines would be attacked, others suspected British territories. A handful of analysts tried to warn their superiors about Hawaii, but their concerns were dismissed as improbable. After all, Pearl Harbor was considered too far, too well defended, too bold a target. Even if Japan wanted war, many believed they wouldn't dare provoke America that directly. But they did dare. As the clock ticked toward the early dawn hours of December 7th, the Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku took their final positions approximately 230 miles north of Oahu. On the command deck of the flagship Akagi, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood silently, gazing at the horizon. He was not a man eager for war. He knew this attack would awaken a sleeping giant, desperate, powerful, and full of rage. But he also knew turning back now would disgrace the Japanese war effort and undermine the months of planning led by the brilliant yet tragic Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto.
Inside the massive carrier hangars, pilots were checking their Zero fighters, their torpedo bombers, their dive bombers, each of them steeling themselves for what would become the deadliest surprise attack in American history. Some wore their family symbols stitched into their flight jackets. Others carried letters from wives or mothers tucked into small pockets near their hearts. Before taking off, many bowed toward the rising sun on the horizon, believing that Japan's destiny rode with them. Then, just before 3 a.m. Hawaii time, the first wave of aircraft was rolled onto the flight deck. Engines roared to life one by one until the entire carrier group trembled under the power of dozens of war machines warming in unison. The sound was like thunder building in slow motion. The pilots watched the deck crews, waiting for the signal, their hands tight on their controls. And at exactly 6 a.m., the first Zero fighter shot down the deck into the cold wind, then another and another, until the sky above the Pacific was filled with the dark silhouettes of 183 aircraft flying south toward Oahu, toward an unsuspecting America. At Pearl Harbor itself, the morning was peaceful. The battleships USS Arizona, USS Oklahoma, USS West Virginia, USS California, and others were neatly lined along Battleship Row. The water was calm, almost mirror-like. The base still slept. A handful of soldiers were waking up, preparing for Sunday breakfast, joking about weekend plans, or complaining about early duty shifts. No one imagined war was minutes away. A small group of American radar operators at Opana Point, however, noticed something strange around 7:02 a.m. Their radar showed a massive cluster of incoming aircraft approaching from the north. But their equipment was new, and they assumed it must have been a group of American B-17 bombers scheduled to arrive that morning. When they called headquarters to report the anomaly, they were dismissed. A tragic misjudgment. A misjudgment that allowed the Japanese planes to approach completely undetected.
As the minutes ticked closer to 7:48 a.m., the Japanese pilots began to see the Hawaiian coastline.
Sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the white beaches, green hills, and navy blue waters of Oahu. Below them, Pearl Harbor came into view, a sleeping giant resting on the sea. And that's when Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, leader of the first wave, looked down, saw the harbor perfectly still and completely unprepared, and shouted the words that would burn themselves into history. Tora, Tora, Tora. The message was sent across the radio waves back to the carriers. It was not a battle cry. It was not a call for courage. It was a confirmation, a signal meaning we have caught them totally by surprise. And at that exact moment, the attack began. The first bomb dropped from the skies like a falling star, then another and another. Within seconds, the quiet Hawaiian morning shattered into explosions so loud they rattled the earth. The first torpedo planes skimmed barely above the water, rushing toward Battleship Row like metallic sharks. A sailor aboard the USS Arizona stepped outside just in time to see a torpedo streaking toward a neighboring ship. Before he could react, the water erupted in a massive explosion, sending a column of steam and debris high into the air. Aboard the USS Oklahoma, sailors were thrown from their bunks as torpedoes ripped open the hull. The entire ship began to tilt violently, alarms screaming, metal twisting, and men scrambling in panic as the massive battleship slowly began to capsize. Some sailors jumped into the water to escape. Others were trapped behind sealed doors with no way out, banging desperately on the steel walls as the ocean swallowed the ship. The USS Arizona, meanwhile, was hit by a bomb that plunged deep into her forward magazines, the storage area for hundreds of thousands of pounds of gunpowder. The result was catastrophic. At 8:06 a.m., a massive fireball erupted, splitting the ship apart, sending flames and black smoke roaring into the sky. Over 1,000 men died in less than 9 seconds. It was one of the deadliest single moments in American military history. Across the base, chaos spread like wildfire. Soldiers dashed for weapons but couldn't find ammunition. Some anti-aircraft guns were locked in storage, and their keys were nowhere to be found. Others had ammunition stored separately in locked buildings. Young sailors grabbed rifles but didn't know what to shoot at because the planes moved so fast. Many fired blindly, hoping to hit something, anything. Meanwhile, Japanese Zero fighters swooped down, strafing the airfields at Ford Island, Wheeler Field, and Hickam Field. American planes were lined up neatly in rows, perfect targets. Fire spread from hangar to hangar. Fuel tanks exploded, sending thick black smoke curling into the sky. Pilots who sprinted toward their planes were shot before they could even climb inside.
At Hickam Field, firefighters rushed to put out burning aircraft, only to be shot at by strafing fighters. Medics dragged wounded soldiers behind buildings as bombs continued to fall around them. The entire base had turned into a nightmare, an apocalypse delivered from the sky. But even through disaster, bravery began to rise like sparks in a storm. A handful of American pilots, still in their pajamas, sprinted across Wheeler Field under gunfire, climbed into their P-40 fighters, and took off without orders. These pilots, George Welch and Kenneth Taylor, were among the very few American airmen who managed to get into the sky that day. They engaged Japanese fighters head-on in a battle that seemed impossible to win. Their courage would later make them legends. On the ground, sailors aboard the USS Nevada managed to get the battleship moving, attempting to escape the harbor despite burning oil and sinking ships blocking their path. Their desperate attempt inspired everyone watching, though the ship was eventually grounded intentionally to prevent it from sinking and blocking the harbor entrance. The Japanese attack lasted nearly 2 hours, 2 hours that felt like an eternity. 2 hours that felt like the end of the world. And yet the true consequences, the true shock, had not yet been revealed. Because after the smoke began to clear, after the fires continued to burn on the shattered battleships, after the wounded were carried to makeshift hospitals, America would soon discover something far more sinister, something that went beyond the bombs and torpedoes, something hidden, something that would answer the mysterious question we raised in Part 1, but not quite yet. Because before that discovery, something else happened, something that would shake the entire world.
When the final wave of Japanese aircraft disappeared into the morning sky, the silence that followed felt unreal, like the world itself was holding its breath. Pearl Harbor was no longer the peaceful paradise it had been just 2 hours earlier. It had transformed into a graveyard of burning steel, shattered ships, drifting bodies, and men crying out for help. Smoke rose in thick black columns that twisted upward into the blue Hawaiian sky, staining the morning with tragedy. The smell of burning oil, metal, and gunpowder coated the air as rescue crews struggled to pull survivors from the water. Some sailors were found clinging to floating debris. Others were trapped inside overturned ships, pounding faintly on the steel hulls, a haunting sound that echoed across the harbor and forced rescue teams to work through the night. Every tap from within the metal tombs felt like a plea for life. Every moment counted. Welders rushed to cut open the hulls of the USS Oklahoma, working until their hands bled, trying desperately to save those who remained alive inside the darkness. Some were rescued. Many were not. On the USS Arizona, fires raged uncontrollably. Entire sections of the ship had been obliterated by the magazine explosion. Thick sheets of flame curled around the broken hull as rescuers tried to get close enough to help, but the inferno kept pushing them back. The ship was lost. Most of the men aboard her never even had a chance to escape. Their bodies remained entombed in the wreckage, still resting there even today. Across the harbor, medical personnel worked without stopping. The naval hospital at Pearl Harbor was overwhelmed within minutes of the attack ending. Hallways overflowed with wounded sailors lying on blankets or makeshift stretchers. Nurses moved from one man to the next, trying to stop the bleeding, treat burns, and calm the terrified. Some men lay silently, staring at the ceiling. Others screamed in pain. Many begged for news of their friends. For most, no answer could be given. As President Franklin Roosevelt was rushed into emergency meetings in Washington, the gravity of the attack became impossible to ignore. The news reached the mainland slowly at first, but once confirmed, radio stations across America broke into regular programming. Families listening at home froze as they heard the words, "The United States Naval Base at Pearl Harbor has been attacked by Japanese forces." Shock shot through every city and small town. Mothers cried. Fathers clenched their fists. Soldiers on leave packed their bags without being asked. America had been thrust into a war it never wanted in a way it never imagined. Back in Hawaii, military officials scrambled to assess the damage. 8 battleships had been hit. 4 were sunk. Nearly 2,000 American planes were destroyed on the ground. Over 2,400 Americans were dead. Many more were wounded. It was one of the darkest mornings in American history. But the deeper tragedy, the truth hiding beneath everything, wouldn't be understood until later that day. Because while officers walked through the ruins of the harbor, taking notes, counting casualties, and trying to figure out what to do next, certain questions began to rise like ghosts. Questions that didn't sit right. Questions that matched the mystery we raised back in the very beginning. Why had several warnings in the days before the attack been ignored? Why was critical intelligence not passed to Pearl Harbor commanders? Why was the radar sighting that morning dismissed as nothing?
Why were American aircraft lined up so neatly, wingtip to wingtip, making them perfect targets? Why did the Japanese achieve such complete surprise? These questions planted seeds of suspicion, and over the next hours, those seeds only grew deeper roots. As investigators sifted through destroyed communications buildings and damaged offices, they uncovered one disturbing reality. Several strategic messages from Japan that hinted at hostility had been intercepted earlier, but due to confusion, miscommunication, and delays, none of them reached the right people in time. Analysts on the mainland had been studying Japanese diplomatic codes for months, and while they managed to break parts of the code, the final, crucial messages revealing Japan's intent were not decoded until it was too late. But the most unsettling discovery came in the late afternoon on December 7th, when an encrypted Japanese message finally reached U.S. officials. It was the final part of Japan's long diplomatic message to the United States, essentially a formal notice ending negotiations, and it had been meant to arrive before the attack. But due to delays on the Japanese side and American decrypting difficulties, the message arrived late. By the time it was translated and examined, Pearl Harbor was already burning. Inside that message, investigators found chilling confirmation. Japan had planned war all along, even while diplomats in Washington pretended to negotiate peace. But that wasn't the twist, that wasn't the secret that shook everyone who read it. The real twist was this, and this is where we finally reveal the mystery hinted at in the intro. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not Japan's original plan. Newly uncovered intelligence that day suggested that Japan expected the U.S. Pacific Fleet to be at full alert. They anticipated America would detect their approach. They expected heavy resistance. They believed their pilots might not return. And yet, everything had fallen perfectly, suspiciously into their hands. This sparked one of the most controversial questions ever asked in American history. Had someone higher up ignored warnings? Had someone underestimated Japan's capabilities? Or worse, had anyone allowed the attack to happen to justify America entering the war? No one had answers. No one wanted to even consider the possibility. But the sudden alignment of intelligence failures made the mystery far too big to ignore. However, before suspicions could grow further, the reality of war took over. On December 8th, the very next day, President Franklin Roosevelt addressed the American people in a speech that echoed across radios nationwide. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. And with those words, America officially entered World War II. Factories began producing weapons at full speed. Young men rushed to enlist. The entire nation unified behind one goal: to fight back. And while America prepared for war, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind the attack, sat alone on his flagship thousands of miles away, contemplating the future. He had executed the plan flawlessly. Japan had inflicted devastating damage. But he knew something that many in Japan ignored. He believed the attack had awakened something powerful, something unstoppable. He famously said, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." He was right. Within months, America rebuilt, reorganized, and struck back with fury. The attack, meant to break America, ended up uniting it stronger than ever. Pearl Harbor became the fuel that drove the United States through the darkest years of the war. Every battle fought afterward carried the memory of the men who died that morning. Every victory echoed with the promise that such a surprise would never happen again.
And that brings us to the final, long-awaited answer to the question from beginning, the secret hinted at in the intro. What was the hidden, shocking truth buried underneath the Pearl Harbor attack? It was this: The Japanese attack was never meant to succeed as perfectly as it did. Their own leaders believed America would be partially prepared. They never expected complete surprise. They never expected the radar alarm to be ignored. They never expected ammunition to be locked away. They never expected battleships to be lined up like targets in a shooting gallery. They never expected their most dangerous mission to unfold like destiny itself. That is why historians, even today, continue to investigate, continue to debate, and continue to ask the same haunting question that millions have wondered. Was Pearl Harbor an unimaginable tragedy, or was it also a preventable one? The truth, buried beneath decades of research, whispers one final chilling thought. Sometimes the greatest mysteries in history are not the ones hidden by enemies, but the ones hidden by fate or by those sworn to protect us.